Good evening. Thank you to everyone for coming out at what is actually an unusual time. Did I just start that right? Why did we decide that much? So I'm delighted to see you, and I know that the reason you're here is because we have such an inspiring and interesting speaker on such an important topic tonight. So again, I'm delighted to see you all. My name is Christina Walbrecht. I'm an associate professor of political science and director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy here at Notre Dame. The Rooney Center is very pleased to be co-sponsoring this talk with the Center for Civil and Human Rights, directed by Professor Jen McAward. And so we're really pleased to bring this to you today. I'm honored to introduce Vesla Weaver. Professor Weaver is Associate Professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Yale, where she is also the founding director of the ISPS Center for the Study of Inequality. Among her many, many contributions to scholarship, she is the co-author of Arresting Citizenship, The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, and co-author of Creating a New Racial Order, How Immigration, Multiracialism, Genomics, and the Young Can Remake Race in America. Her most recent book, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press, is Frontlash: Civil Rights, the Carceral State, and the Transformation of American Politics. Professor Weaver is widely recognized as a leading scholar of racial and class inequality, criminal justice, and the quality of democratic politics in the United States. We are delighted to have the opportunity to learn about her research into how communities understand policing and the consequences for political activism. Please welcome me. Welcome me. You can welcome me as well. Thank you. Oh, I feel so loved. Please join me in welcoming Professor Weaver to Notre Dame.
Thank you, Professor Walbrecht. That was a very generous introduction, and it's a real treat to be here with you today. Oh, you know what? I might have to bring it closer to me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's a real treat to visit your campus for the first time. It's also particularly a treat because I get to inflict on you brand new work that is sort of hot off the data press and is ongoing. So I'm eager to hear what you think, what pops out at you about what you're about to see. In 2015, Americans learned that public authorities in Ferguson, Missouri had imposed a predatory system of government on poor Black citizens. Ferguson residents were targeted, arrested, and summoned on civil ordinance violations, assessed prohibitive fines and fees, and subjected to jail if they failed to pay. Initial monetary penalties served as the gateway for an elaborate poverty trap for citizens who became mired in cycles of perpetual debt and payment and mounting entanglements with police and courts. Ferguson officials, we now know, generated on average 3 arrest warrants per household in the city and revenues enough to cover 1/5 of the municipal budget. But they were hardly alone. It soon became clear that local governments around the country were subjecting American citizens to similar projects of extractive policing and government seizure. As a popular uprising emerged, the Department of Justice report thrust into the spotlight policing and practices deeply at odds with democratic ideals. By contrast, many scholars appeared to be caught off guard, ill-prepared to help us understand how the Michael Browns of America, whose neighborhood was a deep reservoir of adversarial citizen-state relations where discipline and extraction was built into the very architecture of communal life, come to experience the police and state authority more broadly. After decades of a focus on electoral representative politics, primarily at the national level, my own subfield of American politics did not have much on the intellectual rack, so to speak, that could be used to make sense of predatory local governments and specify its impact. And yet, the share of Americans encountering criminal justice had grown substantially and had no historical precedent. For example, using data on the experiences of young adults in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, we see that in 1979, 11% had been arrested, 8% convicted, and 2% incarcerated by the time they hit 23. But among the cohort coming of age 2 decades later, after a period of substantial crime declines, Over a quarter had been arrested, 12% convicted, and 6% incarcerated. The result is that some Americans now experience their most direct, memorable interactions with government through a prison, court, or police station. The focus on police violence from Michael Brown's death in journalistic circles actually obscures the everyday, mundane nature of police interactions in Black communities, only a few of which lead to ended life, but most of which convey incredible damage to Blacks' conceptions of citizenship and equal worth. Here we're looking at the increase in police stops in a matter of just a few years in New York City. Why only New York City? Because we actually don't know how many Americans have a police stop in any given year in the rest of America. We only know this for certain cities that are under consent decrees and court orders to provide these data. And what you can see here is that in 90% of those police encounters, no contraband was retrieved, and the person was not engaged in enough illegal activity to warrant an arrest or summons. Instead, they were stopped for things like furtive movements, this is actually recorded in the data, walking in a high crime area, or wearing clothes commonly used in a crime. These encounters, we now know, are heavily concentrated spatially. So much so that the place you call home, not your criminal activity, not your law obedience, is going to designate whether you have an encounter with police. Like Brownsville, Brooklyn, where the police stop rate was so high that every single Black man would have had to be stopped 5 times in a single year to account for it. Lower class Blacks and Latinos are much more likely to live and go to school in areas of greater police presence. In fact, schools in Baltimore now have a regular probation officer on staff to deal with the large portion of school kids undergoing supervision. And not a single Chicago city school is without police officers, metal detectors, and routine searches of school lockers for drugs. They might live in public housing where vertical patrols and police raids are familiar, and seeing someone taken away in handcuffs or spread eagle up against a cop car is a fairly normal background condition. Today, I want to argue for a new approach in order to develop better theories of how communities understand police authority and construct communal narratives and seek to define their own identity and right to move throughout the city. Several key questions guide this enterprise. First, how do Americans narrate their interactions with police authority? What discourses do they draw on to make sense of their experiences? Is there a common script or narrative across city spaces? And how do they relate these experiences to ideals of the American dream, democratic inclusion, community well-being? How do they counter portrayals of their neighborhoods and confront the daily practices that encompass state action there? And how, most basically, has Ferguson shaped the collective memories of a young generation? What are portals? They're a bridge, a wormhole, a conversation across space, maybe even time. They're gold repurposed shipping containers that are equipped with immersive audio video technology. You can place them anywhere, in a city square, in a neighborhood, in a community gathering spot. The designer and my colleague Amar Bakshi originally wanted to connect people in United States cities in real time to a Syrian refugee camp, to Tehran, Kigali, and Herat. He wanted his grandmother to connect with her old neighborhood in Lahore, Pakistan. He initially faced hurdles. Actually, one neighbor, he originally had it in his backyard, and one neighbor thought he was a member of a terrorist cell and called the FBI on them. But by now, 25,000 conversations have taken place in gold shipping containers like these, including the Obamas, Samantha Power, John Kerry. A portal may be eliciting conversations between Washington, D.C. and Herat in the morning, Tehran in the afternoon, and Havana or Mexico City in the evening. Now, upon entering the container, which is covered in gray carpet, a participant is connected by life-size video and audio with a complete stranger a randomly paired person in an identical gold shipping container in another city in real time, perhaps even in a different time zone. This creates the illusion that one is in the same room with someone who is, in fact, on the other side of the country. Through portals, we're provided with an opportunity to read one another's body language, bond over our shared or divergent lived experience, and to confront difficult political issues in collaboration with one another. It's mobile. We can place it wherever we have an internet connection. It's interactive. People are having face-to-face conversations. It's deep, where surveys are often shallow, and it transcends space, allowing people to connect despite large geographical differences. Now, our motivation for this was threefold, I should say. First, and I won't dwell on this long, but current research on policed populations is totally inadequate to help us understand how the residents of neighborhoods like Michael Brown's that are characterized by saturation policing come to understand how police authority is experienced, how policing is shaping the political thought and action of communities where it's concentrated, and to identify patterns across different ecological contexts. Note how often surveys miss these populations. When I was writing with my co-author Amy Lerman, Arresting Citizenship, we could not find a single political science survey that asked people about basic bureaucratic encounters. Things like receiving welfare, things like getting evicted by the housing authority, things like having an arrest or getting a conviction. The Washington Post recently did a large survey of law enforcement, of 8,000 law enforcement officers, but no such data exists of the people in highly policed communities. It's all too often, we thought, in the aftermath of social unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, at the hands of, following Michael Brown's death at the hands of a white police officer, to hear news, commentators, academics, and pundits opining, people who live in places like Michael Brown's neighborhood think this, that, and the other. They did this by speaking to one or two residents at best, and certainly they editorialized without walking a day in their shoes. In like manner, too often reformers at the policymaking table regularly make invisible the very individuals, families, and communities whose neighborhoods are ground zero of our nation's failed policy experiment of mass incarceration. Portals gives the microphone to places like the Amani neighborhood in Milwaukee, a place where only 1/3 of the men have not been confined in a cell. The second motivation was that we believed to reach this understanding, it was necessary to disrupt the traditional method for understanding American citizens through survey questions that ask people whether they strongly agree, some would agree, neither agree or disagree with this or that policy item. Instead, we wanted to actually listen to what members of these impacted communities said in their own terms, in interaction not with researchers, not with us, but in conversation with others distant physically, but from similar neighborhoods. Through open-ended, freewheeling conversations, Portals empowers people to say what they think in their own terms without the rigid constraints of surveyor-defined questions and forced choices. It allows us to see processes of co-creation of ideas rather than simply snapshots of opinion. And it allows for neighborhoods separated by race, class, geography, city to exchange thoughts. And third, and this is the piece that I haven't yet researched, but we wanted to see that if we could empower communities so often marginalized by contemporary discourse to have a say and to amplify the voices of those who are often unheard. Could we create connected political spaces from disconnection? Can we make ordinary people the lifeblood of grassroots politics? Until recently, civil society thrived in physical public spaces, town squares, churches, barbershops, civic associations, and bowling leagues. It was here that we connected to other human beings in real time. We had conversations, we created relationships, we took political actions, and we spoke with those who were different from us. With the advent of modern technology, however, we began to disconnect from one another, consuming media, but only sporadically engaging others in person, and communities began to exist digitally. Today, social media dilutes the conversation by allowing us to edit our public personas. Dissenting views we can filter from our Facebook posts by just simply deleting friends and through customized algorithms that we don't know how they actually work. We're rarely exposed to those with whom we disagree, and we can quickly silence differing opinions and viewpoints. Our personal spheres have become separated and curated. Our worlds support fiercely exclusionary group identities. By placing portals in city squares, we're exploring whether this artistic, architectural, technical media intervention can enable new types of encounters and new spaces for politics. Portals transforms the capacity of disparate people and communities to define their narratives, to engage each other politically. By creating this wormhole and bridge through places often unheard, we're trying to create the public square of the 21st century. And it's through these connections that we understand our voices are not singular, but they're connected. Today, I discuss preliminary themes from the pilot that we did in 5 sites. Soon we will expand these, but basically we recorded 250, well, more than that now. We've transcribed 250 of these conversations. Oftentimes they're 2-person conversations, sometimes more, between different neighborhoods. Now, participants engage in approximately 20-minute conversations. Sometimes they go longer. It's not exactly perfect. With somebody else in a paired city that the person doesn't know. Now, what's crucial is that the individuals are speaking to each other. Their conversation is not moderated by a researcher or even guided by traditional research questions. Instead, portals participants are prompted by a singular question, something like, how do you feel about the police in your community? Each of the portal's dialogues is video recorded, and we've transcribed the initial conversations, and we now have a rich archive of collective memories, experiences between people who would not otherwise encounter each other. Today, I'm largely drawing, grad students, cover your ears, on my own hand coding. Eventually, when we get all of the transcripts back, we will learn how to do systematic machine learning or supervised learning text analysis. But right now, I'm just pulling out the themes that really rose to the top of some of these conversations. Okay. Right now, we have 2-way conversations going on between Newark, Chicago, Milwaukee, Baltimore, and we recently put a portal up in the Boyle Heights section of LA, right outside Self-Help Graphics. Now, I can go into greater detail about these communities, but I'll save that probably for the end. What I will say is there are a variety of different public spaces. So one, as you can see, is the one in Baltimore is outside a big historic market. There's another in Newark that was in Military Park. We've since shifted it to Lincoln Park, which is ringed by social service agencies that support a population that has had lots of police encounters. This is our recent one in Chicago, in South Chicago. And finally, the one that's been up the longest is Milwaukee, which is in this Amani neighborhood in a zip code that now has a documentary about it, the 53206 zip code. What's interesting about that zip code is that it has the highest share of incarcerated Black men in America and one of the highest rates of poverty in the city at 47%. By age 30 to 34, only 38% of men have not spent time in a correctional facility. As you can see, there's literally not a city block in this area that has not endured the incarceration of a resident. So how does it work? The process is powerful in its simplicity. The portal is staffed not by us, but by a member of the community, a curator, who does outreach, holds events, and describes the study. There's two things that are crucial about the curator. One is that they have the trust of the community. They live in the community. They have friends in the community. They've often grown up in that community. So Louis Lee, who has been in the Milwaukee portal for almost a year now, he describes that he was meant for this job. He has had two brothers die of gang violence. He himself has endured gunshot wounds. He's been incarcerated for many years, and he sees this as his life's work. He finds that the portal is doing all kinds of good in the community. It's seen as a public good. Another important aspect of the curator is that they're not running our study all the time. They're doing lots of different things. So they're connecting around the globe. They use the portal. In fact, Louis Lee has a Facebook page called 100 Ways to Use the Portal, where he uses it for kids on hot summer days that need to escape and get some air conditioning, for chess tournaments, for artistic performances across communities, for going to another place, right? So oftentimes it's not just connected Milwaukee and Newark and Chicago and Baltimore, but they're connecting to the portals in global cities. He's used it to have community policing dialogues that were not for our study. So police in Milwaukee connected with police in Newark and had a conversation. In other words, they're a real gathering spot. They're used for all kinds of things: tournaments, artistic performances, dance-off, poetry, slams, all kinds of things. Mostly the people who, first we put the portals in high foot traffic areas. So places where people mostly walk by, wonder what a big gold shipping container is doing in the middle of their sidewalk or neighborhood, and they approach the portal curator. The curator then tells them about our study, says, do you want to come inside? Do you see what? So this person is looking at our IRB forms to see what the study is about. Some people come through word of mouth, but most people are just sort of passing by. If they decide they want to have a conversation, they take a quick iPad survey that asks them basic demographic information, and I'll show you some of this in our results later, and asks things about their prior police experience, asks things about whether they've been the victim of violence, whether they trust the police, whether they have confidence in the police. And then once participants enter the portal container, they will be alone, except for the people that they're speaking to in the other city. So here you're seeing, because I can't show you the people in our study, you're seeing Devad, one of our curators in Newark, talk to Louis in Milwaukee. When people leave a portal, they come out giddy, weeping, and everything in between. After their conversation, they can sign a gold book, which now contains hundreds of pages of entries of remarks about the experience. Eventually, we will transcribe these too and match them up with the conversations and with the surveys. What I can say now, not having a systematic analysis of it, is that people often come out deeply moved, their consciousness pricked. Many of our participants had never been on vacation to another place. So this was a bit like having a pen pal, for those of us that are old enough to remember what that was like. Louis even claims that violence in his community has gone down and that the portals has created a community on the move. He says that the conversations have initiated a groundswell of local activism and projects like building a vocational school, conversations with public officials who never came to the neighborhood before. And he describes a community rising up to change the conditions facing their lives. Now the city of Milwaukee is putting forward funding to keep the portal indefinitely. One says, there's so much negative news about Chicago, and this is a chance for us to share who we are beyond the headlines. Today I'm going to be drawing just on Chicago, Milwaukee, and Baltimore conversations because we have enough conversations back transcribed and we have all the survey data. As you can see, our sample was mostly Black and male. This will change once we get more conversations from Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. Many of the participants are young. They're under 25 for the most part. Half were under 25 in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee sample, you can see, reported slightly more contact. And this was shocking to me. So we asked them how many times they had been stopped by police for something other than a simple traffic ticket. And you can see that there's a skew. Half of the participants have been stopped more than 7 times. Like, this is one of those moments when you're creating your survey that you're like, oh, I should have had like another category on top of 7, right? I thought that this would capture enough. Many revealed in their conversations that they had been incarcerated before, that they had endured a stint in jail. I will say, even though we're capturing some fairly similar demographic groups, there's variation. There's a lot of Southern migrants that came to Chicago and Milwaukee in the data. There's interesting things that happen when young women pair with older Black men. We do have some women in the conversations, and I'll draw on some of those in a minute. We have a very few that are people with middle-class ties. Participants had also had very recent contact with police. Less than 20% had their last stop over 5 years ago, and strikingly, contact was quite recent. About half of participants in Milwaukee and 43% of respondents in Chicago had an involuntary encounter with police in the last week or month. Now, in a moment, I'm going to give a snapshot of some of the prominent ideas that surfaced in the dialogues. This is not a full accounting. There are many others. But these are themes that potentially recast how we understand the politics of race-class subjugated communities. From the survey, the majority, and I'll show you this in a minute, reported being very early in their adolescence when they had their first encounter with a police authority. The emotional force of minority youth's first experiences of the police baptizes them in a way, supplying a visceral and lasting memory of the state exerting power over their bodies. The legal scholar Devin Carbato, drawing on his own experience, calls it a racial naturalization. Jerome Miller describes it as a normalized puberty rite. He says, quote, "The secrets of the experience are shared with peers and adult males, the majority of whom have also been subjected to the same rites. The experience, in a sense, touches archetypal memories." The conversations we've looked at so far reveal that this baptism moment was a key turning point, a defining moment of state humiliation and memory of learning one's place in the political order, the end of their childhood, so to speak. It was often recalled in great detail. So, for example, one woman said, "I've been having problems with them since I was 12. I will remember this day because it was my first police interaction. Me and my cousin was walking down the street from the store, and it was some girls that went in after us, like a group of girls. But we had come out because I told my cousin, she was younger than me at the time, she was like 10. So I'm like, come on, I think they own some stuff. So we leave. And the girls ran past us. They went in there and stole some stuff. They ran past us, and the police just came and grabbed up me and my cousin. We not with them. We don't even know them. And I remember this officer," and she named him. He a real big dude, like I was scared as shit. I was 12 years old. I thought I was gonna die. And others recounted how young they were when they had their first memory. So one says the police come into his house, and all of a sudden he has a gun to his head, and he's 12 years old. Another says he was truant from school, and he ends up being thrown on the ground and given a ticket for resisting. And this next one, she says she's a full-figured girl, and the police would stop her and basically ask her if she was a prostitute. And she was 13. I was 8 years old. I was in 2nd grade. As you can see from the survey, these aren't the outlier cases. The majority of Portal's participants were very young when they experienced being stopped, patted down, thrown up against the hood of a cop car, sometimes even having a weapon drawn on them. The other thing that surprised me was gender. You'll have to help me with this because I'm not sure how exactly to theorize it. But policing in these communities, I would argue, has made motherhood a contested authority. While many women articulated their own foundational memories of police treatment, they very quickly went to the experience of their sons and brothers. They braced for the day their young boys entered teenage years. Some of them said, "I'm glad my son is small. I'm glad he wears glasses or has braces and looks nerdy." They were embarrassed at being relieved that a son was of small stature. They chided President Obama for not understanding what it was like to have a black son. They prepared their children. And they described the secondary policing that they experienced and the arbitrary control of their households, a reclaiming of their authority. Consider a conversation between Kim and Tina. Kim says, "I can't keep calm. I have a black son." I think she's riffing on that cup that says, "Keep calm and carry on," or some such, right? Now, Kim then describes living in Brownsville. "Anyway, the police have stopped my son twice coming from the train." Why? "Because he was walking too fast." "Yeah, that was recently. That pisses me off." I'm like, "What the hell? You supposed to walk slow, dragging?" "I don't allow him to wear his pants down and none of that. I cannot let the police dictate to me how to control my household. I cannot let the police dictate to me how to raise my kids. Now they want to tell us we can't put our kids outside. It's too much. It's too much." Or a conversation between Wanda and Cora. Wanda describes how her daughter comes into the portal and talks, and she says, "Ain't nobody ever done it to me. I don't know nobody that's been shot. My son's already been snatched off the bus, put in handcuffs. He was only 11. He played basketball, so they got to do fresh, threw down. He had a whole other story, and they live in the same house, in the same community." Now, Cora then goes on, I don't have the whole transcript here, but talks about her experiences with her kids and police, and she says, "I think we're doing good, but we're going to move to Minnesota, so hopefully we get a different experience." Wanda then says, "Like I said, if you ask my son, now my son has never been in jail, but has he been harassed by the police? More than 7 times, and he's only 17. He's never been in trouble. He's never been in a police station. Has he been in handcuffs? Yes. The police stopped the bus, and my kid's 9 and 11. They stopped the bus, grabbed them off the bus, threw them against the police cars, put handcuffs on them so tight, by the time they got home, they could still show me the scars. Then I thought about it, because I had 2 daughters first, that we never been through this. I forgot I have to prepare them for this. That just changed who they was. That changed their perspective on life in that moment. That happened to them a couple times. It happened to them several times because they're athletes and they're really tall now. They're like 6'3", 6'2". They all walking, coming home from a game, they got to get frisked. They got to get their phones stomped on. Cora, they go on and they discuss. And then Cora says, "It was nice meeting you." And here's why I like having conversations rather than snapshots. So watch what Wanda says. "You two, I hope you have a good stay in Minnesota. But America is America. I know a few people down there, but they face the same problems we face." The next theme that really jumped out at me, because I've been somebody that's studied Black politics for a while now, linked fate, for those of you who have taken a Black politics or race politics course, know that this is a canonical concept in our field. When evaluating a political decision, so the logic goes, Blacks make a utility calculation. What's good for the group is what's good for me. Linked fate is a political resource for subjugated groups. It helps them mount collective action problems and intra-racial differences by seeing a common foe and a common purpose. Those high in linked fate, studies have shown us, tend to evaluate candidates differently. They're more likely to take political action, to unite behind a candidate or a policy response, and to support things that advance their race. So I was expecting, given that we're in this Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee moment, Sandra Bland moment, to find a linked fate, a strong linked fate conception that Black people were united across class, across neighborhood, across other political differences against police oppression. right? It's all we're seeing in the news. We're witnessing grassroots political action. And yes, a linked fate conception can be seen in these dialogues. Yes, people shared a similar set of stories and experiences, life outcomes and travails. Perceptions of police discrimination ran high in these conversations, but solidarity did not form, and political action was distorted. Crucially, people described how divided the community was, atomized even. A linked fate that might have emerged was interrupted by the incentives to remain alone. It was only as a loner that one could remain under the police radar, to have some quiet from police intrusion in their neighborhoods. This conversation between a man in Chicago and Milwaukee shows what I mean. Like I tell these little shorties right here, it's bad enough that we killing, y'all out here killing each other, then you got the police out here killing y'all too. They want us to do that. Nobody literally wants to link up because we're scared of each other. We're not sticking together as a black community, man. Me personally, I am antisocial for my own good. Nobody is going to hurt me if I am by myself. But if I'm with a clique of people, 9 times out of 10, somebody's going to pull up on you. When you're with a group of people, you become suspect. And I'm not really sure in that conversation whether he's talking about the police or other people, members of his community. Again and again, people related this idea of needing to stay by themselves, stay in the house, not be out walking. So one that really hit me, the red one, it's like we can't be like 3 or more. We can't walk to a park to go play basketball with like 3 or 4 people without expecting to have to, worry when a police pulls up, because they like to sit us in handcuffs, sit us directly on the sidewalk, then check us and act like we're a major threat. And others go on, talking about how they had been incentivized to remain alone. Indigenous Black politics and political action, I would argue, has been constrained, in large part due to police actions. Despite the rise of a fervent insurgent movement against police violence that we're all witnessing from Ferguson to Baltimore and beyond, conversations reveal a recoiling from engagement with each other and with the state, in contrast to our expectations and to the expectations of linked fate. Now, one of the things we asked participants on the survey about before they entered the portal conversation was their confidence in local police. And we can see that confidence is in low reserve, especially in Milwaukee. Now, what this doesn't tell is the story of why. Through the dialogues, we begin to see that the roots of this perception were in police being a presence in their community, but not really knowing or understanding them. Even as they described the struggle to unite within, many dialogues also described being policed from without, from outsiders who parachute in from the suburbs to make arrests and who exhibit a fundamental misunderstanding of and disregard for the neighborhoods they police. One from Milwaukee said, "I don't feel like a person who don't come from this area, who don't come from especially the ghetto, I don't think they should be policing and teaching because they don't understand us. There's things about us they don't understand. They could never understand because they haven't been through what we've been through. They haven't seen what we've seen. They think, okay, it's a choice to do a crime. You had a choice to do this. You had a choice to do that. They think it comes down to simple shit, when you know it's more complex than they really fucking know. And instead of busting everybody down ASAP, I think they should get to know the niggas that's always on the block. I think they should get out their cars, smoke a square, chop it up, talk to everybody, get to know people, you in this neighborhood." That kind of conception came up again and again and again. This idea that police would come in, take actions on a community that they didn't have the full story about. Okay. Others, and there's a rich history of the idea of community control within the Black intellectual tradition, and that came up again and again and again. We should police our own communities, right? There was a collective yearning to be policed by those who have a connection with the community. Now, conversations also went beyond individual encounters, and there's several themes that popped up among dialogues about how people perceived the broader system. What is the function of policing? And this was perhaps the most striking theme that hit me, at least, because I've never seen it in a survey, actually. We found a collective sense that the system, that those that were in the dialogue perceived the system as functioning beyond its stated goals of public safety, crime control, and punishment for running afoul of the law. Many dialogues also describe the system as functioning primarily to generate profits and revenue that flowed out of their communities and into the pockets of government agencies. Participants commonly articulated how the system made money off of them, that their communities endured disproportionate taxation and financial drain, how their limited resources were often seized abruptly and arbitrarily. Phrases like, we're nothing but a check to them. They lock people up to make money. Jailing is big business here, and we're cheaper to imprison than to educate, littered the conversations. It was taken for granted that their communities were actually paying for the city's settlements of police misconduct suits. So remember, in Chicago, the gunning down of Laquan McDonald is happening during this time. And this is another cool thing of the portals, is that we had the portal in Milwaukee before, during, and after the shooting of Sylvell Smith there, and during the riots or urban disturbances there. They perceived that their communities enabled white police officers to live a good life in the suburbs, alongside the findings of delinking being positioned as a potential profit source, and the redistribution of resources away from their communities also hindered a politics from below. A young man was leaving the portal on one of our visits. He held a paper bag in his hand with his county inmate number on it. He had left the county jail only moments before entering the portal. He spoke bitterly about men like him being held at ransom. We're being locked up and held at a ransom. I call that a ransom, not a bail, because this is a system that's created for the rich to get richer. You understand what I'm saying? We're not the rich. I feel as though the system is created, why? To generate more money for commissaries, for my family to spend more money on commissary food, and other families, for other inmates who are in there. I have a 4-year-old son. I don't wish to spend my money on commissaries. I don't wish to pay lawyers' fees and court seat fees and pawns and things like that. No, I want to give this money to my son. You know, the summertime is coming. My son loves nature. So you know what I thought about while I was in that cell was doing more things that involve nature with him. Taking him to the zoo, taking him to the park, taking him to the beach. That's where I wish to put my money at, not back into this injustice system. And this is probably, I hope this isn't too small for you to see, but I've thrown out in red all the times people mentioned money, city getting paid for their incarceration. Many described the police as tax collectors or collection agencies for the city, a system of regressive taxation. One of them says, well, it comes out of taxes, like that's how it is. If you walk into a store and someone is rude and disrespects you, you're not going to spend that money with them, right? But we have no choice. We are the ones paying their salary. If you get rude service, you can leave a store, but we don't have a choice. We're basically paying you to kill us and be rude and disrespectful, and they're getting paid for this out of our pockets, our hard-earned money. They wondered aloud why their communities had to pay for being disrespected and harassed and sometimes gunned down, and why they were being fleeced, and how their resources were depleted, and how police were used to protect the rich and their assets. So you probably have all read these already, but the one that really comes to my mind is peace is not attractive to them because it does not make them any money. They don't make money off peace. They make money off chaos. It called to mind the invisible political economy that embeds the poor in a system of family dependency based on state actions. I'm talking about the fact that when a man is sent to prison, he is considered voluntarily unemployed and must continue to make child support or have the debt accrue. The proliferation of court fees, child support enforcement, and other encumbrances pose a tax on the poor families attached to justice-involved people. And this carceral-related debt has become both an engine of growth for correctional institutions at the same time as it has depleted and derailed the economic prospects of families attached to these men and women. two political scientists, well, one political scientist, one sociologist, Mary Katzenstein and Alexis Harris, have described the shadowy instruments that the state has employed to seize the resources of families and practices that put these families at enormous financial risk. Though largely unrecognized, these instruments are the state, quote, quietly taxing the corporate entity of the family. So for example, you've got, well, let's take the example that the young man in Newark who was arriving with his county inmate number on his paper bag said, commissary. Families pay $1.6 billion into commissary accounts each year, $1.4 billion into money bail in non-refundable fees. 41 states have something called inmate user fees. In other words, you are charged for your own room and board and for the services attached to being jailed, things like health care, things like dental care, things like your uniform. In Riverside, California, this amounts to $142 a day. These are for families that are making probably less than $30,000 or $20,000 a year, or in prisons that are giving, on average, their inmates 93 cents a day in payment for the work that they do, right? Prisons are exempt from minimum wage laws. And in towns like St. Louis, the towns that make up St. Louis County, they generate 40% of their county revenue in court fines and fees. And this is just showing that the average Black man leaves prison with an average of $17,000 in debt. Portals, we use portals to move across communities. Instead of studying communities in isolation, portals brings communities together and people and neighborhoods with non-overlapping experiences. Portals conversations will exist across several divides: socio-political, class, race, generation, and city. Right now, we're connecting to like with like, similarly highly policed areas of the cities. But soon we're going to have portals up in more rural, white and poor locations, middle class locations, locations outside of college campuses. In these conversations, we've gotten blips of the different life worlds that people are experiencing across boundaries of race, class, and location. In contrast to many middle-class Americans who experience a government as a submerged state, to use the words of Suzanne Mettler, that rarely interferes with their personal autonomy and distributes various material benefits in ways unobservable by this class of citizens. For residents of communities such as Ferguson, state interference is routine and expected, making the state an obstacle and frequently an adversary. The revenue system is dependent on fees, as I've just said, for minor transgressions. It's bolstered by informal private systems of financial seizure, like payday lending, commercial bail bonds, postal code profiling. Schools are oriented to disciplining and monitoring in addition to educating. The safety net is not only less uplifting, but designed to regulate the sexual behaviors and other behaviors and sanctioning people for non-compliance with a host of rules. And the police and penal system constitutes a major way that citizens interface with government. If the mark of middle-class living is reduced contact with the public sector, to quote Patricia Fernandez-Kelly, for the poor, the state is all over. Now, narratives highlighted these stark contrasts between formal legal empowerment and the right to be free from state interference and the daily lived experience of citizens in poor communities. So the first one is one of our only conversations that's happening across that divide. Because I'm a white guy and you're an African-American male, so I haven't been stopped by the police in a year, believe it or not. You said in the last 6 months you've been stopped 5 times. I honestly don't know what to tell you because I don't experience that. I can say things, but I don't know what you go through on a day-to-day basis. This one's interesting. The system wasn't geared for Black people, it was for the people that had slaves. Slavery, the imagery of slavery and the brutality it encompassed the plantation, the slave master is all over these conversations. People will say things like, it's no different today. You know, we might have been getting whipped back then, but we're still getting whipped. They also noticed the vast disparities between the kinds of treatment they could expect as young black men and the kinds of treatment they knew would happen to whites or to police officers that committed violent actions. This came up a lot. This is just one quote, but it comes up all over the place. Police get a pension. They get a reward for gunning us down, right? He get a pension. He started GoFundMe and become a millionaire. Many, as this one says, talked about the various neighborhoods, and they had a very acute mental mapping of the kinds of police activity that one could expect if one were on 47th and Burleigh versus some other part of the city. Okay. Another theme that came up, and I'll just go through this quickly, so I want to save some time for questions. For people who live in police-saturated neighborhoods, day-to-day experiences of policing foster new conceptions of identity and practices of social valuation, such as the delineation of decent and law breaking. A large amount of time in these conversations was spent on how the police viewed them and their communities and groups. And as you can see here, even without the fancy text analysis and supervised machine learning, there are certain images that come out. We're treated as animals, less than human beings, dogs, nobodies. Degraded, they call us the zoo. They're paid to protect and serve, but they're not protecting us, they're not serving us, they're killing us and eliminating us. All I can say is they done put down the rope and picked up a gun. It's also interesting to see the conversations happening between people that lived through earlier eras of oppression, because often they will say things like, well, it used to be this. The police used to be bad, but at least they would help you, or they would come when you called them for help. But now they're doing X, Y, and Z. And they'll note differences in time, differences across time. The final, I think this is the final theme, pulls on something that my co-author and collaborator has written, encyclopedias about, and that is the idea of procedural justice and police legitimacy. And the idea here is that people don't fundamentally care about the outcome of contact with police. They don't care if they were taken to the police station as long as they were treated with decency and fairly. What they care about is being disrespected, even if they have the outcome of getting off. Being treated fairly inspires people to feel that larger state authorities are respectful, benevolent, fair, just. And studies have found, including by my collaborator Tracy Mears, that when you are high in procedural justice, you are much more likely to engage the system when you're in need. You're much more likely to serve as a witness, to call the police for help when you need it, to report criminal activity, to call the police, okay? When procedural justice is in low reserve, or police legitimacy is in low reserve, you're much more likely to not call the police. And we see this again and again and again. So this first one says, I called you. They got into a scuffle or an argument about some monetary transaction in the store, and they called the police. When the police came, instead of him talking to me like I'm talking to you respectfully, he got up in my face and said, I said, shut up. That's not the way you talk to me if you want me to shut up. Then you need to address me better than that. I understand you're a police officer, but I'm still a citizen, and I called you in to help me. I didn't call you in to talk to me like I'm trash. They locked me and my son up. This came up a lot too. I feel like they do too much. You got a lot of people saying the police, they do too much. They be like extra. We don't even, we go home and we shut all the doors, let all the blinds down, we go to bed. Another person, this came up a lot too, women calling for a domestic issue, and all of a sudden they end up suspects. Many described turning from victim into suspect, police not responding to them. So in many conversations, I was surprised by how often this happened. I don't have a count or a number, but people would say, if you're selling Lucy's, or if you got a little bag of weed, or if you've got an open container, or you're cursing in public, the police will be there very quickly. But if someone is shot in the head and they're bleeding out and you call, the police take their time to come, okay? One meme that's come up in Chicago is the police want guns. So what they do is they go all over the city and they bury guns. They bury guns. So that when they're stopped by police, they're able to say, there's a gun over there, and the police let them off. All they want is their guns to get their extra credit or whatever they get. One of the biggest findings of my last book, Arresting Citizenship, was that these kinds of encounters tend to socialize people into and out of political life. They teach lessons about citizenship and political standing. They tell people about their worth as citizens and residents. And we see this again in these conversations. And then finally, there's, this is sort of replicating what I've shown you earlier, but how much do you trust the police? And you can see again, there's a skew. The theme that I haven't worked on the most, but has been coming up, is a sense of resistance, a sense of ways that populations tried to exert some political autonomy from police intrusion. So how do people mobilize? How do they seek to preserve a positive identity and regain their dignity? What kinds of actions are they taking in these communities? One of the motivations I spoke about earlier in launching the portals was to take policing, so often a source of trauma, joblessness, indignity, and community destabilization, and to turn it into a space for positive ideas, activism, shared meaning, and resistance. People from some of our nation's most disinvested, most surveilled communities have a space to share ideas across communities. They may come to see their experience linked to strangers in neighborhoods many miles away, and they may come to feel that they're heard and have ownership over the issues that dog their lives. And through making our nation's conversation about criminal justice more democratic, more inclusive, and more informed by the people directly affected by police authority, it has the potential to affect wider political discourse, or so that's my hope. As police powers advance marginalizing and controlling forms of racial isolation, they also foster insurgent political resistance, social movements that target systemic abuses of police powers, find their counterpart in everyday practices designed to obstruct policing, practices that are often dismissed as personal rather than political defiance, but that Kathy Cohen rightly theorizes as politically meaningful opposition. These aspects of policing and racial socialization tend to receive very little analytical attention because of a longstanding tendency in my field to view these communities in terms of their deficits, in terms of what they lack, in terms of their lacking organization or resources or efficacy or trust, rather than as resourceful, creative, and deliberate political actors. It's clear to us now that these communities regularly engage in collective opposition to policing abuses in their neighborhoods, to processes of criminalization, as we've seen in Victor Rios's work, and to systematic racial injustices in the legal system. Contemporary examples range from no snitching campaigns to the movement in Chicago by Anita that ousted the person that covered up Laquan McDonald's gunning down, to collectively pursuing jury nullification in drug cases in Baltimore, to efforts to become cop-wise and reverse police, the police that we know from Forrest Stewart's work. We also see in these dialogues concrete examples of worked out policy responses to stakeholders' challenges. They're simply waiting to be heard. It was interesting to me how often people said something like, we need to control our narratives. See, what people see about us on the news isn't right. We're kings and queens. We're creative. We're entrepreneurs. We just don't have the resources. And you see snippets throughout the dialogues of a community trying to redefine who it is and what it possesses and what it can become. And then I can talk about where we're going next, but I'd like to get to questions. Let me just end. This is part of a Carnegie-funded project called Faces of American Democracy, where I'm toying with the idea that we have authoritarian enclaves, to use Robert Mickey's term, within the United States. I wanted to tell a story about American inequality, that marginalization is not simply a story of market inequality, poverty concentrated differently across neighborhoods, or even overt racial discrimination. Instead, it's a broad difference in the way the government, from schools to welfare offices to housing authorities, and especially the police, orients itself towards its residents. It's not only that people in communities like Ferguson are exposed to a different set of material harms concentrated in particular spaces that make them vulnerable. People in these locales are treated as a suspect class who need and deserve oversight across a dizzying array of institutions. Casting these communities as simply vulnerable to market forces displaces the unique role played by government. Our project hopes to provide a corrective, beginning from the observation that the experience of police authority in poor communities is a central aspect of what it means to be poor and an urban resident, and therefore we must examine these experiences if we are to understand the daily lives, citizenship, and political discourses in poor communities. We also wanted to upend the conventional approach to politics in low-income communities. We can learn about each other through the news media, a medium that more often exacerbates our stereotypes of distant communities, or we can learn from each other through interaction. We can try to understand what Ferguson meant to its residents and beyond by asking people neat dichotomous survey items on whether they disagree with this or that, or we can actually hear people describe in their own ideas and dreams for reform and see what policing is through their eyes, through those who have firsthand experience. We can try to promote understanding and accountability between police and their residents through mandating new codes of conduct, through having dash cams and cameras on the body. Or we can also promote understanding by coming to know, really know, the communities that are being policed. We can substitute Facebook likes for conversation that disagrees with or challenges us. We can disengage, feeling the politics of our time are a futile endeavor. Or we can build a new grassroots narrative, one that becomes a resistance politics. Thank you, and I invite your questions. Sure. And I'm happy to answer anything that's here or not here, please.
Just try outside the room. When you had a lot of quotes from the people who've done the surveys, some of them refer to themselves as African American, yet others refer to themselves as Black. What's the difference? You finding in different cities or different?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I don't know. I mean, there's various perspectives on this. I personally like the term Black because it conveys both the larger Black diaspora, in other words, that people in West Indian places have also Black identities. It's a more politicized term. African Americans, I mean, I don't know the generation of the term.
You had the quotes up there, and I thought, are those from a different city or just different? Mm-hmm.
I haven't looked at that.
Because it was self-naming. So
yeah, exactly.
People that are saying, my community of African Americans, and then I'd say, they're looking at us Blacks this way, and then it's on one slide, it's very disparate.
I have not actually looked at whether that's like, okay, people in Baltimore said this versus.
The way it was explained to me is Michelle Obama is Black and Barack Obama is African American. Because he has an African parent. And that, I think they might have said.
I almost
that might
never.
be an Obama.
I'm from a Black family, and I almost never use the term African American. It has always sounded like what uncomfortable whites say about Black people, but that's just me. That's just
My
me.
friends are insulted to be called African.
It's, I feel like, I don't know the history of it, but it feels like a made-up term. Black feels like more politicized.
It's hard being on the outside knowing what to say, you know.
Please.
I'm not an expert in this, but I have read somewhere that I can't cite off the top of my head, but a lot of it's similar to like Hispanic and Latino, and one is like a term that was given to a group versus one is a term that was claimed for themselves. And so in terms of Latino versus Hispanic, I know that it might be similar but
Similarly, I almost never say Hispanic. I always say Latino. I don't know why. I don't know. Latino feels more politicized. Please.
I have one comment on that, and then I have another question, but I think it was really interesting to hear, because when I first started, I was like, she's like, I'm gonna ask her, what is she? Anyway, you can answer that or not, because I get it all the time. But anyway, the way you described it, Black, like you're saying, like your experience was like, it was interesting, like Black, you looked at it as a global term, which is the absolute opposite of me. Like I say, for me, I'm Black, because I'm in America, and Black is different, like being from like a slave population and kind of growing up, you're an amalgamation of Black, white, Native American, you know, it's a whole different experience than having people coming, you know, now or more recent immigrants who are, that's their national identity, like they're from Africa and so on and so forth. But I think it's largely like self-defined.
Well, it's interesting because they were self-defining it.
People have all kind of ways, you know, of defining that. So I think it's something, you know, you have to talk to a person specifically, you're gonna get it across the board. My question for you, if I can digress, I don't know if anybody has a question about, any more comments about that, is I'm on the city council here in South Bend. This is clearly an issue that is all over the country, but, you know, I have a very specific interest in, you know, finding some answers like right now. And so this is great data, and we talk about the importance of like the qualitative versus just the quantitative, and so this is beautiful. And it's great for people, I think it's informative to some degree, to people who don't have that experience. Of course, people who are telling the stories, they already know it, right? Yeah. So how do we use this, or how have you used this, or how have you planned to use this to actually change the lives of the people who are oppressed? I feel a great sense of urgency, especially in my new role, because like I'm getting calls like every day, and texts like every day. This happened to me, that happened, that happened to me. Like, how can local governments capture this information and then use it for transformation? Have you seen that at all?
I think we're doing a really bad job of it. And I think the first step is, I serve on the executive council or the executive session at Harvard and the National Institute of Justice of Community Corrections. And our charge over 3 years was to create a document that would thoroughly reform and transform the criminal justice system. And it was amazing to me how often some of us at the table had to keep pushing on this idea of Black criminality, which has become really, really embedded in our national discourse. And so this is going to be a long answer to your question, because frankly, I don't think that body cams are going to do it. I don't think that greater police training is going to do it. I think we're actually in the situation that we were in 40, 50 years ago when the modern criminal justice system was birthed during the 1960s, where people thought that throwing money at the problem would reform the system. What it did was it built a bigger system, and it built multiple constituencies that now had an investment. So I just had an argument the other day with Bruce Western, who's a prominent, person in this area. I said, well, we need to create financial incentives for local cities and agencies to start doing less of bad policing. We need to get the money out of there. We need to actually starve the beast. I am fundamentally a proponent that police officers should never be engaged. People with a gun and a badge should never be giving somebody a ticket for something that is civil in nature, for selling loose cigarettes. So one model that I play around with, this is crazy out there, but why isn't it? Why don't we have the equivalent of meter maids, okay, giving out those kinds of tickets? Why is it that we don't have a highly professionalized police force where you need to have lots of education? Almost like, I don't even know what the equivalent would be, but I want to get local police out of the business of policing poverty crimes. These are fundamentally poverty crimes. So that's one level of sort of like what we need to do is, so when you go back to the city council, like if somebody says, well, we need to have a training on implicit bias, like just end that conversation right there and move to something more radical. The other thing I wanted to say to you is I actually do think we need a fundamental transformation in our political consciousness around this. So if I leave you with one thing today, it's this. If you were to, and I've looked at the data on this, if you were to draw, somebody did a crime, yes or no, and somebody had contact with police or with the criminal justice system, yes or no, where do you think a legitimate criminal justice system should fall? Which quadrants?
The upper left, you commit a crime and you have contact.
You want, for a legitimate criminal justice system, you need a tight coupling between those who are seriously breaking the law, and by that I mean committing something that induces bodily injury, and people who are having some kind of adversarial contact with criminal justice. This is exactly where we were in 1970. What happened over time, and I've done this, I've looked at cohort studies, is that we shifted from this to this. Well, guess which demographic group is in which box? For the most part, whites are here and blacks are here.
I was alive in 1970. There was a lot of race troubles, especially
If you look at the
68,
data, we had a very small criminal justice system. We had very few people getting a conviction. We gave people probation instead of jail. What happens over time, this is what the data shows. Coming back to your question, for me, we need a fundamental consciousness change. Ferguson brought into view this, but we need to bring into view this. I'm sorry to say it, but until we confront the fact that criminality is not specific to the black race, we can't get out of this. Every time I give a talk, people say, but well, blacks do commit more crimes. No. If you look at the data, whites commit rape, drug selling, drug abuse, robbing, stealing. I've done probably 10 felonies, and I tell this to my students because I need them to understand, until we break the link in our public consciousness that black people deserve confinement, being gunned down, and being pilfered in the way that they are because they committed crimes. Until we get there, we will have this same conversation. Our kids will be having this same conversation. I think we have to have an understanding that certain communities can expect to have no contact with the criminal justice system, but also do things that if they were in other communities, if they were other skin colors, and if they didn't have resources, they would be serving time. And this is a story that you will not find no one has done this. At some point, wait for it, I will publish this in the New York Times. This is coming. This is my next thing. That's a bigger, I don't know what the policy response is, but until our consciousness, until our idea, our narrative, our collective American narrative over who is criminal and who is not changes, until we understand, and this is what Khalil Muhammad calls the disappearance of white criminality, when I ask my students, how many of you have done something that could have landed you in jail? How many of you have driven a car drunk? How many of you have stolen? How many of you have done some drugs? Everybody raises their hand. And I say, well, were you arrested? They're like, there's the expectation of security from police intrusion. That is a solidly white middle class privilege that blacks do not enjoy. And until we're willing to have that conversation, I really don't think giving police a few body cameras is going to do it. Because at the end of the day, the damage that's being done to black youth who at age 11 know what it is to get frisked I literally, in my other book, had somebody who spent 4 days in jail pregnant for cursing on somebody else's answering machine. Like, literally, had a criminal record from that. Minor transgressions should never elicit. So maybe when you go back to the city council, maybe it's a matter of changing some of the municipal codes and making sure that a kid, this could be my child, the first state authority that they encounter should never be a police officer. It should be a crisis worker, a street outreach worker, it should be a mental health worker, a drug abuse treatment something, or it should be, how about this, nobody, the parents. So that's my own personal opinion, and I really do think we're not going to get out of this mess without really radical shifts in both practice and in public consciousness.
I'm from Dallas, and so I was particularly, captured by the assassination there, and then the community and police response, and impressed actually with the police chief and the other police officers and the community members who spoke out about their opinions of the police. And having grown up, I'm not quite old enough to have experienced the Kennedy assassination, but the Dallas police, took a bad rap for a long, long time. And they somehow changed their image and their interaction with their own community. And so it seems as though you should somewhere in America be able to find some cities that are doing this well. And I would like to see a portal in Dallas, so that people could share how their police somehow have established a better relationship. I did not hear from the Dallas citizenry the kinds of, statements that you received and you would expect from Chicago and also, part B, could we not tap into this chief somehow and whatever, or this whole, unit, that whatever expertise they have in building this better community relationship, can we not somehow grow this across the country? Should he not be a national consultant or something for, he was really impressive. Some of you are shaking your heads. You must have heard him because he was just
so that, can I?
He was so impressive.
Okay, so I'm so sorry, but this is something I'm very excited about. So the Department of Justice under the Obama administration actually directly spoke with the chief of Dallas, and they did this national survey on community-oriented policing. One of Loretta Lynch's last actions as the Attorney General was to fund a $50 million grant for community-oriented policing programs, which is getting officers in ride-along programs. Dallas is really great because they have a week called Community-Oriented Policing Week. Their football teams come out, the police officers are out there, and they just have like, for the adults, there's like wine and cheese night. There's like just stuff to get the officers embedded within the community.
Yeah, when you mentioned meter maids, I turned to Richard and said, on a bicycle with a Labrador.
Right.
I mean, that's what they need, you know,
Yeah.
like they need community relation builders, not
Yeah.
police men.
But I also
You
think,
tell me that the Trump administration cut that off.
Okay, so.
That's where we were going.
So the $500 million was already awarded to police departments.
Okay.
So that funding is already dispersed, and they've been doing this for the past 4 years. The question is, will the Department of Justice continue the funding?
Thank you.
Because the programs are, I think they're funded until 2017. So once 2017 hits, that's when it's like, okay, we're under a new administration. But that's also where my question comes from, because, so I'm really interested in restorative justice practices, and community-oriented policing as a whole, especially with like children. There's been like a criminalization of the youth. So like police are being called to schools for crazy things. I did teen court, and I had a 7-year-old who like was charged with grand theft because he walked out of the library with a textbook that had CDs in the back. So it was $301. And he was arrested. He was handcuffed. I didn't even know they made handcuffs for children. How does it fit? So my question is, you said body cameras and implicit bias trainings are not the answer for the solution. And I'm wondering, while they may not be what shifts the hearts and minds, can't that be what holds police accountable to the criminal justice system? Because the criminal justice system has stops in place for actions like this. They're just not being enforced for whatever reason. So I'm wondering if like there can be a balance of this hearts and minds shift, but also like a procedural kind of.
I mean, look, in the absence, it's a good point. In the absence of anything, I would rather have body cameras and police trainings. I just don't think, I feel like the conversation is getting stuck there in the national political discourse as though that's the miracle. Oh, look, we'll solve our problem of devaluing Black life through technology, through body cameras. I just don't think it's enough. I actually don't. If you go back, I have a project where I've looked at every single statement of every Black intellectual leader, from James Baldwin to Zora Neale Hurston, and on in between, people in the Harlem Renaissance on up. It is amazing to me how much police power was really the fundamental site of Black oppression. You go back to the Black Panther Party platforms, you go back to even people, let's not take the Black Panther Party, let's take somebody moderate, right? Let's take, I can't even think of who right now, but Walter, Whitney Young, okay, or Walter White, they were talking about police oppression. This is a decades-long mistake and state failure, the accumulations of failures to appreciate what role police were playing in Black communities and to rectify it. So I think, going back to your point, you talked about, are there models, and you talked about, are there models of best practices that we can be emulating where the police community relations are actually one of trust and help and recursive dialogue? Yes, of course. There's, one model that comes to mind is the sheriff in Portland, Oregon decided, you know what? Most of the cases in our jail are coming to us because somebody has a lapse or some sort of mental breakdown or drug issue. And if we can treat that and figure that out instead of throwing the police at the problem, maybe that will help. So what he did is every single sheriff patrol car has a mental health worker riding alongside the police in the front seat. Things like that. So, and they saw empirically their cases went way down because they had somebody who was trained. I think part of the problem is we're enlisting our police with multiple different roles. They're meant to be school counselors, they're meant to be mental health workers, they're meant to be drug crisis workers, they're filling all these roles that actually the original way we saw police was not to do that, right? I don't think we should have police in schools. Or that actually one of the Portals Conversations talks about how back in his day, the police were in schools, but they were to protect us from people coming in from the outside, not to slam young girls down on their desks, you know. So I think part of it is that the idea of policing has expanded beyond its useful boundaries, and we need to get back to policing as a last resort, not a first resort for all manner of basically poverty problems. And that actually, like, there's work on how this actually affects police officers, right? They're being asked to deal with problems that they don't know how to deal with. Now, on restorative justice, since you mentioned that, I don't mean to be like the naysayer, but I also think that restorative justice comes up short. Here's why. Or it's being touted as something that has bad consequences too. So the idea of restorative justice is people take ownership and are meant to restore the victims of their crimes, right? And that through that process, you get a better outcome, less recidivism, da, da, da. I think it's really harmful when we go into Black and brown communities, and I saw this all the time in arresting citizenship. The jails that we worked in, the halfway back facilities that we worked with, had these huge posters on the wall that said, "Make better choices. You are here because of you. Make tomorrow different. Don't, you know." You grew up in a subjugated communities with piss poor schools, really unsafe conditions, really bad public investment, terrible housing, gangs, this, that, and the other. And now we're telling you that everything that led you to this point is on you. I think we need a structural conversation, and restorative justice is not that. We need a conversation where we empower people by actually giving them the tools to be angry about the injustices that they witness in their schools, in their housing, in their communities. And that would lead to, I actually bet that, I haven't done any study on this, but would lead to less recidivism. If people were given a language that goes beyond, you're here because of you, but you're here because your community was disinvested in, and let's change that, you know? So I mean, these are all just sort of personal opinions, but I don't like, and here's where I would disagree with my collaborator, Tracy Mears. I don't think amplifying individual accountability is where we want to go. I'm sorry, you got bad schools and no jobs and a really bad infrastructure, but everything that you did is on you. So if you turned to the drug markets because getting a job at McDonald's was too difficult, that's on you. Make your absolution, make your penance or whatever. No, it's like ridiculous, right? Now, I do think victims should receive restitution. I also believe and know, because I've looked at the empirical data, that victims and offenders, they're the same people. If you actually look at the data, the same people that are victimized are the ones that go on to offend. We tend to not think of that because we think victims are one group of people and offenders are another. But no. So we actually need to address the traumas and victimizations that communities that are criminogenic have endured.
Can I say something quick about restorative
One
justice?
last quick question, and then we gotta let this poor woman have a break and feed her some dinner.
No worries.
We're working so hard. Go ahead, or
Oh, just.
I'll let you follow up and I'll do my question.
Okay, comment about restorative practices. I think that you're right about that if you don't have the right people at the table. Because again, to me, a true restorative process would include the system, would include everybody around the circle, And
That's a good
everybody
point.
comes together to where, like, because I work in schools,
Mhm.
and we've been trying to get this restorative practice together, but it's not okay when you say, oh, okay, it's your fault, right? You know, all those things, you're absolutely right. But I think it has to be done well, and that's where it fails, is when we don't implement it with fidelity, the way,
Yeah.
if everybody
Yeah.
comes to the table, the teachers, the officers, the superintendent, you know what I'm saying? City council people, you know, and really attack the problem from all of those areas, the structural racism, but then, you know, also everybody taking accountability makes a difference. I think it can.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So I guess I'm articulating a more fulsome, full-throated idea of restorative justice, where all of the failures are taken account of, not just an individual's
That's what
decision
needs
to
happen.
victimize or whatever. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for this amazing project. And it's already monumental, so I think my question might be slightly unfair, but I'm still gonna ask. Not a question, but many of the things you're saying and you're narrating from all the stories, from all the conversations and interactions, there are things that I've seen in other places in Latin America, like exactly the same interactions, exactly the same patterns are in other countries where policing is highly militarized, and you still see these kind of relationships between citizens and communities. Have you thought about, because I mean, following that idea of portals connecting people from the US with Lahore or other places, having this similar pattern occurring for, like, say, Rio de Janeiro and Chicago? I know the language might be a barrier, but there are very common stories there, and this would be fascinating to see how these patterns of oppression are repeated across very unequal democracies.
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't done it yet, and I don't know that we have enough funding to do it, but I was telling Beatriz Magaloni, who does work in Mexico, she has a new project in Mexico City about these portals, and she was like, she does work on policing in Mexico City. She was like, I want to use this portal. So I may very well want to do that. I think it's a little tricky because, like, for instance, we don't have Spanish-speaking Latinos, right, or exclusively Spanish-speaking Latinos in the United States, because part of the idea of portals is that you need a common language. So most of the dialogues are happening without a translator. Maybe Amar has used translators in other portals around the world. I don't know. Like, I don't exactly know how is he connecting a Syrian refugee camp using a common language. So there's a little bit of, like, it seems like it would be a more expensive proposition to do that, especially if you have a translator. So now you're, like, transcribing a translated. But you know what? It's not out of the realm of the possible. And I was inspired after you know, reading Yanilda Gonzalez's book on police activity all over Latin America, that, like, wow, I kept noting in the margins, this is exactly the same kinds of phenomenons. This is exactly the way they position themselves. So maybe I will do it. So if you have a particular idea about how to do that, I would be eager to hear it.
All right, thank you all very much for what was great.
What about you?